The G7 and the G20 are showing limitations in their ability to cope with complex global crises. The 20 finance ministers at the central bank governors meeting was held on July 15th, local time, in Bali, Indonesia. At the meeting, criticism from Western countries was focused on Russia, which started the war in Ukraine. The conference was held in 3 sessions: the global economy, global health, and the international financial system. Discussions were made on the Ukraine war and the resulting rise in prices, as well as the economic impact of the global crisis. After World War II, governments of major countries exercised the flexibility to respond to severe economic crises. However, the G7 and the G20 also have limitations in their ability to cope with complex crises such as global inflation, food shortages, and unstable energy supply triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and rapid carbon neutral policies of major countries. As Russia, China, and the West, led by the United States, faced each other, it became difficult to expect such cooperation any longer. The biggest post-war global economic crisis is approaching, with war, inflation, and food shortages overlapping. Unlike past crises, cooperation between governments of major countries have collapsed, making it almost impossible to reach consensus. Leading countries, including the United States, launched the G7 summit to overcome the economic crisis of the 1970s triggered by the 2 oil shocks. In the 1990s, the G20 summit was launched in order to cope with the foreign exchange crisis in emerging countries and the global financial crisis. In the early 1970s, when the Bretton Woods system that supported the global economy collapsed and the first oil crisis broke out, leading countries such as the United States, Britain, France, and Germany sought to form a consultative body to cope with the new economic crisis. In 1973, George Shultz, who was the U.S. Treasury Secretary, proposed to the British, French, and German finance ministers to form the so-called Library Group, a meeting of finance ministers of 4 countries. This gathering is the mother of G7. With the participation of Japan in 1975, it became the G5 finance minister system. The G5 finance ministerial meeting was naturally elevated to a summit as disgusting than French finance minister and German finance minister Helmut Schmidt later became president and prime minister. In November of the same year, the first G6 summit, including Italy, was held in Rambouillet, France. The following year, at the request of the United States, Canada joined and the G7 was officially launched. The G7 was composed of developed countries whose gross domestic product accounted for more than 4% of the world GDP at the time, acted as a central axis of coping for the 20 years since the launch of the G7. The world economy has been in a relatively peaceful period. Afterwards, as the world situation became unstable due to the foreign exchange crisis that swept Asia and emerging countries such as Korea in 1997-98, the necessity of forming a new cooperative system between countries emerged. In December 1999, the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors held their first meeting in Berlin, Germany. In addition to the G7 and the G20 included many emerging countries such as China, Russia, India, Brazil, and Korea, whose international influence has rapidly increased due to rapid economic development. The reason why the G20 was newly formed despite the existence of the G7 is that as the status of emerging economies, including China, has grown, it has become difficult to effectively cope with the global economic crisis with the cooperation of a small number of advanced countries. One of the achievements of cooperation among G20 member countries during the global financial crisis was that they decided not to take a protectionist response that could accelerate the global economic recession and effectively implemented such an agreement. However, the situation changed with the Ukraine war that began in early 2022. The United States and its Western allies imposed widespread sanctions on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, and Russia counterattacked, leaving the G20 in a state of disintegration. The G20 is no longer effective as a system for responding to the economic crisis. China and India, the key G20 members, also supported Russia behind the scenes, making it difficult for the G20 to speak as one as in the past. If the G7 and the G20 also lose their effectiveness, there is no group or organization that can reach out to help. As the G7 and the G20, which played a key role in responding to global economic crisis in the past, were divided, the shadow of an economic recession was cast in major economic regions such as the United States, Europe, and Asia. The U.S. Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, is taking a giant step by raising the benchmark interest rate by 0.75 percentage points last month from 0.75 to 1% to 1.5 to 1.75% in order to respond to the lowest inflation in 40 years. It is unclear whether the price will be fixed. Experts say that the current crisis situation, which overlap with war, inflation, food shortages, and unable energy supply and demand, is different from the past in that it is difficult to reach an agreement between the major powers to respond to the crisis.